events are organized into the circle of time, so that the pure past, which defines them, is itself still necessarily expressed in terms of a present, as an ancient mythical present. What does this mean? The empty form of time, or third synthesis. Time itself unfolds, instead of things unfolding within it. We may define the order of time as this purely formal distribution of the unequal in the function of a caesura. The second time, which relates to the caesura itself, is thus the present of metamorphosis, a becoming equal to the act, and a doubling of the self, and the projection of an ideal self in the image of the act. As for the third time, in which the future appears, this signifies that the event and the act possess a secret coherence which excludes that of the self. Eternal return in its esoteric truth concerns and can concern only the third time of the series. Active synthesis is defined by the test of reality in an objectal relation, and it is precisely according to the reality principle that the ego tends to be activated. The virtual object is a partial object, not simply because it lacks a part which remains in the real, but in itself and for itself because it is cleaved or doubled into two virtual parts, one of which is always missing from the other. In short, the virtual is never subject to the global character which affects real objects. The partial or virtual objects are encountered under various names, such as Melanie Klein's good and bad object, the transitional object, the fetish object, and above all, Lacan's objet A. Conversely, these virtual objects are incorporated into the real objects. Incorporation, nevertheless, remains the condition under which the self-preservative drives, and the active synthesis which corresponds to them can, in turn, and with their own resources, fold sexuality back onto the series of real objects, and from without integrate it into the domain ruled by the reality principle. Virtual objects belong essentially to the past. However, the pure past, as it was defined, does qualify the virtual object, that is, the past as contemporaneous with its own present. Virtual objects are shreds of pure past. Eros tears virtual objects out of the pure past and gives them to us in order that they may be lived. Lacan discovers the phallus understood as a symbolic organ. The symbolic phallus signifies no less the erotic mode of the pure past than the immemorial of sexuality. The symbol is the always displaced fragment, standing for a past which was never present. The object equals X. The traditional theory of the compulsion to repeat in psychoanalysis remains essentially realist, materialist, and subjective or individualist. It is realist because everything happens between presents. It is materialist because the model of a brute, automatic repetition is presupposed. It is individualist, subjective, solipsistic, or monadic because both the former present, in other words, the repeated or disguised element, and the new present, in other words, the present terms, of the disguised repetition are considered to be. Not even the Jungian discovery of archetypes can correct the weaknesses of such a conception. Even if we oppose a collective or cosmic unconscious to the individual unconscious, the former can act only through its power to inspire representations in a solipsistic subject, whether this be the subject of a culture or a world. Repetition is constituted not from one present to another, but between two coexistent series that these presents form in function of the virtual object equals X. The displacement of the virtual object is not therefore one disguise among others, but the principle from which, in reality, repetition follows in the form of disguised repetition. In short, there is no ultimate term. Our loves do not refer back to the mother. It is simply that the mother occupies a certain place in relation to the virtual object in the series which constitutes our present, a place which is necessarily filled by another character in the series, which constitutes the present of another subjectivity, always taking into account the displacements of that object equals X. Behind the masks, therefore, are further masks, and even the most hidden is still a hiding place, and so on to infinity. It signifies the displacement, which essentially affects the virtual symbolic object, both in its series and in the real series in which it endlessly circulates. Repetition is thus, in essence, symbolic, spiritual, and intersubjective or monadological. The phallus as virtual object is always located by enigmas and riddles in a place where it is not, because it is indistinguishable from the space in which it is displaced. The problems concern the eternal disguise, questions the eternal displacement. Problems and questions belong to the unconscious, but as a result, the unconscious is differential and iterative by nature. It is serial, problematic, and questioning. We have encountered a second beyond the pleasure principle, a second synthesis of time, in the unconscious itself. The first passive synthesis, that of habitus, presented repetition as a binding, in the constantly renewed form of a living present. It ensured the foundation of the pleasure principle in two complementary senses, since it led both to the general value of pleasure, as an instance to which psychic life was henceforth subordinated to the id, and to the particular hallucinatory satisfaction which filled each passive ego with a narcissistic image of itself. The second synthesis, that of eros nemazine, posits repetition as displacement and disguise, and functions as the ground of the pleasure principle. In effect, it is then a question of knowing how this principle applies to what it governs, and under what conditions of use, and at the cost of what limitations and what extensions. The answer is given in two directions. One is that of a general law of reality, according to which the first synthesis points beyond itself in the direction of an active synthesis and ego. In the other direction, by contrast, the first synthesis is extended in the form of a second passive synthesis, which gathers up the particular narcissistic satisfaction and relates it to the contemplation of virtual objects. Time, empty and out of joint, with its rigorous, formal, and static order, its crushing unity, and its irreversible series, is precisely the death instinct. Death does not appear in the objective model of an indifferent inanimate matter, to which the living would return. It is present in the living in the form of a subjective and differentiated with a C experience, endowed with its prototype. It is not a material state. On the contrary, having renounced all matter, it corresponds to a pure form, the empty form of time. It is these three syntheses which must be understood as constitutive of the unconscious. The first synthesis expresses the foundation of time upon the basis of a living present, a foundation which endows pleasure with its value as a general empirical principle to which is subject the content of the psychic life of the id. The second synthesis expresses the manner in which time is grounded in a pure past, a ground which conditions the application of the pleasure principle to the contents of the ego. The third synthesis, however, refers to the absence of ground into which we are precipitated by the ground itself. Thanatos appears in third place as this groundlessness, beyond the ground of Eros and the foundation of habitus. In one sense, the third synthesis unites all the dimensions of time, past, present, and future, and causes them to be played out in the pure form. In another sense, it involves their reorganization. The system of the future, by contrast, must be called a divine game, since there is no pre-existing rule, since the game bears already upon its own rules, and since the child player can only win, all of chance being affirmed each time and for all times. Difference must immediately relate the differing terms to one another. In accordance with Heidegger's ontological intuition, difference must be the articulation and connection in itself. It must relate different to different without any mediation whatsoever, by the identical, the similar, the analogous, or the opposed. This communication relates differences to other differences, constituting differences between differences within the system. These second-degree differences play the role of the differentiator with the C. In other words, they relate the first-degree differences to one another. This state of affairs is adequately expressed by certain physical concepts, coupling between heterogeneous systems, from which is derived an internal resonance within the system, and from which in turn is derived a forced movement, the amplitude of which exceeds that of the basic series themselves. The nature of these elements, whose value is determined at once both by their difference in the series to which they belong, and by difference of their difference from one series to another, can be determined. These are intensities. Thunderbolts explode between different intensities, but they are preceded by an invisible, imperceptible, dark precursor, which determines their path in advance, but in reverse, as though intagliated. Likewise, every system contains its dark precursor, which ensures the communication of peripheral series. The precursor plays the part of the differentiator, C, of these differences. We call this dark precursor this difference in itself, or difference in the second degree, which relates heterogeneous systems and even completely disparate things, the disparate. The question of whether psychic experience is structured like a language, or even whether the physical world may be regarded as a book, depends upon the nature of the dark precursors. Esoteric words are properly linguistic cases of object equals X, while the object equals X structures psychic experience like a language on condition that the perpetual, invisible, and silent displacement of the linguistic sense is taken into account. In a sense, everything speaks and has sense, on condition that speech is also that which does not speak. The eternal return has no other sense than this, the absence of any assignable origin. In other words, the assignation of difference as the origin. These differential systems, with their disparate and resonating series, their dark precursor and forced movements, are what we call simulacra or phantasms. The eternal return concerns only simulacra. It causes only such phantasms to return. Perhaps we find here the most significant point of Platonism and anti-Platonism, the touchstone of both Platonism and overturning of Platonism. The true Platonic distinction lies elsewhere. It is of another nature, not between the original and the image, but between two kinds of images, idols, of which copies, icons, are only the first kind, the other being simulacra, phantasms. It seems to us that, with Plato, a philosophical decision of the utmost importance was taken, that of subordinating difference to the supposedly initial powers of the same and the similar, that of declaring difference unthinkable in itself and sending it, along with the simulacra, back to the bottomless ocean. According to this image, thought has an affinity with the true. It formally possesses the true and materially wants the true. Thereafter, it matters little whether philosophy begins with the object or the subject, with being or with beings, as long as thought remains subject to this image which already prejudges everything, the distribution of the object and the subject as well as that of being and beings. We may call this image of thought a dogmatic, orthodox, or moral image. It certainly has variant forms. Rationalists and empiricists do not presume its construction in the same fashion. The conditions of a philosophy which would be without any kind of presuppositions would take as its departure a radical critique of this image and the postulates it implies. It would discover its authentic repetition in a thought without image. It cannot be regarded as a fact that thinking is the natural exercise of a faculty and that this faculty is possessed of a good nature and a good will. Concepts only ever designate possibilities. They lack the clause of absolute necessity, in other words, of an original violence inflicted upon thought. The clause of a strangeness or an enmity, which alone would awaken thought from its natural stupor, or eternal possibility. There is only involuntary thought, aroused but constrained within thought, and all the more absolutely necessary for being born illegitimately of fortuitousness in the world. Thought is primarily trespass and violence, the enemy. This element is intensity, understood as pure difference in itself, as that which is at once both imperceptible, for empirical sensibility which grasps intensity only already covered or mediated by the quality to which it gives rise, and at the same time that which can be perceived only from the point of view of a transcendental sensibility, which apprehends it immediately in the encounter. With regard to memory, it is not similitude in the reminiscence, but on the contrary, the dissimilar in the pure form of time, which constitutes the immemorial of a transcendent memory. Between the intensive and thought, it is always by means of an intensity that thought comes to us. In effect, the intensive or difference in intensity is at once both the object of the encounter and the object to which the encounter raises sensibility. It is not the gods which we encounter, even hidden. The gods are only the forms of recognition. What we encounter are the demons, the sign-bearers, powers of the leap, the interval, the intensive, and the instant, powers which only cover difference with more difference. A false proposition remains no less a proposition endowed with sense. Nonsense would then be the characteristic of that which can be neither true nor false. In every respect, truth is a matter of production, not of adequation. It is a matter of genitality, not of innateness or reminiscence. Sense is the genesis or the production of the true, and truth is only the empirical result of sense. There is only one kind of word which expresses both itself and its sense, precisely the nonsense word, abraxas. So many authors have recognized in diverse ways the mechanism of nonsense is the highest finality of sense, just as the mechanism of stupidity is the highest finality of thought. Far from being concerned with solutions, truth and falsehood primarily affect problems. A solution always has the truth it deserves according to the problem to which it is a response, and the problem always has the solution it deserves in proportion to its own truth or falsity, in other words, in proportion to its sense. The problem or sense is at once both the site of an originary truth and the genesis of a derived truth. A problem is determined at the same time as it is solved, but its determination is not the same as its solution. The two elements differ in kind, the determination amounting to the genesis of the concomitant solution. The problem is at once both transcendent and immanent in relation to its solutions. Transcendent, because it consists in a system of ideal liaisons, or differential relations, between genetic elements. Immanent, because these liaisons or relations are incarnated in the actual relations which do not resemble them, and are defined by the field of solution. Problems and their symbolic fields stand in a relationship with signs. It is the signs which cause problems and are developed in a symbolic field. The exploration of ideas and the elevation of each faculty to its transcendent exercise amounts to the same thing. These are two aspects of an essential apprenticeship, or process of learning. For on the one hand, an apprentice is someone who constitutes and occupies practical or speculative problems as such. Learning is the appropriate name for the subjective acts carried out when one is confronted with the objectivity of a problem, idea, whereas knowledge designates only the generality of concepts or the calm possession of a rule enabling solutions. To learn is to enter into the universal of the relations which constitute the idea, and into the corresponding singularities. To learn to swim is to conjugate the distinctive points of our bodies with the singular points of the objective idea in order to form a problematic field. Learning always takes place in and through the unconscious, thereby establishing the bond of a profound complicity between nature and mind. Why Plato determines the conditions in the form of reminiscence, not innateness. In this manner, time is introduced into thought, not in the form of empirical time of the thinker, subject to factual conditions, and for whom it takes time to think, but in the form of an in-principle condition, or time of pure thought. Time takes thought. Why should it be that so many fundamental principles concerning what it means to think are compromised by reminiscence itself? For as we have seen, Platonic time introduces difference, apprenticeship, and heterogeneity into thought, only in order to subject them again to the mythical form of resemblance and identity, and therefore to the image of thought itself. A new Meno would say it is knowledge that is nothing more than an empirical figure, a simple result, which continually falls back into experience, whereas learning is the true transcendental structure, which unites difference to difference, dissimilarity to dissimilarity, without mediating between them, and introduces time into thought, not in the form of a mythical past or former present, but in the pure form of an empty time in general. The limit must be conceived not as the limit of a function as a genuine cut, a border between the changeable and the unchangeable within the function itself. The differential element is the play of difference as such, which can neither be mediated by representation nor subordinated to the identity of the concept. Problems are dialectical. The dialectic has no other sense, nor do problems have any other sense. What is mathematical, or physical, biological, psychical, or sociological are the solutions. Ideas are multiplicities. The idea is defined as a structure. The birth of structuralism at this point coincides with the death of any genetic or dynamic ambitions of the calculus. If ideas are the differentials of thought, there is a differential calculus corresponding to each idea, an alphabet of what it means to think. Structuralism seems to us the only means by which a genetic method can achieve its ambitions. There are three conditions which together allow us to define the moment at which an idea emerges. 1. The elements of the multiplicity must have neither sensible form nor conceptual signification, nor therefore any assignable function. 2. These elements must in effect be determined, but reciprocally by reciprocal relations which allow no independence whatsoever to subsist. 3. A multiple ideal connection, a differential relation, must be actualized in diverse spatio-temporal relationships, at the same time as its elements are actually incarnated in a variety of terms and forms. Ideas are by no means essences. Insofar as they are the objects of ideas, problems belong on the side of events, affections, or accidents, rather than on that of the theorematic essences. Ideas are developed in the auxiliaries and the adjunct fields by which their synthetic power is measured. Consequently, the domain of ideas is that of the inessential. It is as though every idea has two faces, which are like love and anger. Love in the search for fragments, the progressive determination and linking of the ideal adjoint fields. Anger in the condensation of singularities, which, by dint of ideal events, defines the concentration of a revolutionary situation and causes the idea to explode into the actual. We must not see mathematical metaphors in all these expressions, such as singular and distinctive points, adjunct fields and condensation of singularities, nor physical metaphors in points of fusion or congelation, nor lyrical or mystical metaphors in love and anger. These are categories of the dialectical idea, the extensions of the differential calculus. Mathesis universalis, but also universal physics, universal psychology, and universal sociology, corresponding to the idea in all its domains of multiplicity. They are what is amorous or revolutionary in every idea, by virtue of which ideas are always unequal glimmers of love and wrath, which have nothing in common with any natural light. There is no more opposition between event and structure, or sense and structure, than there is between structure and genesis. The true opposition lies between idea, structure-event-sense, and representation. With representation, concepts are like possibilities, but the subjective representation still determines the object is really conforming to the concept as an essence. That is why representation as a whole is the element of knowledge which is realized by the recollection of the thought object and its recognition by a thinking subject. The idea makes a virtue of quite different characteristics. The virtuality of the idea has nothing to do with possibility. Multiplicity tolerates no dependence on the identical in the subject or in the object. The events and singularities of the idea do not allow any positing of an essence as what the thing is. No doubt, if one insists, the word essence might be preserved, but only on condition of saying that the essence is precisely the accident, the event, the sense, not simply the contrary of what is ordinarily called the essence, but the contrary of the contrary. Multiplicity is no more appearance than essence, no more multiple than one. In fact, the idea is not the element of knowledge, but that of an infinite learning, which is of a different nature to knowledge. For learning evolves entirely in the comprehension of problems as such, in the apprehension and condensation of singularities, and in the composition of ideal events and bodies. Learning to swim, or learning a foreign language, means composing the singular points of one's own body, or one's own language with those of another shape or element, which tears us apart, but also propels us into a hitherto unknown and unheard of world of problems, to what we are dedicated, if not to those problems which demand the very transformation of our body and our language. In short, representation and knowledge are modeled entirely upon propositions of consciousness which designate cases of solution, but those propositions by themselves give a completely inaccurate notion of the instance which engenders them as cases, in which they resolve or conclude. By contrast, the idea and learning express that extra propositional or sub-representative problematic instance, the presentation of the unconscious, not the representation of consciousness. It is not surprising that, among many of the authors who promote it, structuralism is so often accompanied by calls for a new theater or a new non-Aristotelian interpretation of the theater, a theater of multiplicities opposed in every respect to the theater of representation, which leaves intact neither the identity of the thing represented, nor author, nor spectator, nor character. Ideas occur throughout the faculties and concern them all, according to the place and the existence of a faculty determined as such. They render possible both the differential object and the transcendent exercise of that faculty. Ideas must be called differentials of thought, or the unconscious of pure thought. Ideas, therefore, are related not to a cogito, which functions as a ground or as a proposition of consciousness, but to the fractured I of a dissolved cogito, in other words, to the universal ungrounding, which characterizes thought as a faculty in its transcendental exercise. Once chance is affirmed, all arbitrariness is abolished every time. Ontology is the dice throw, the chaosmos, from which the cosmos emerges, contrary to what is stated by the banal propositions of consciousness. Thought thinks only on the basis of an unconscious, and thinks that unconscious in the transcendent existence. Consequently, far from being the properties or attributes of a thinking substance, the ideas which derive from imperatives enter and leave only by that fracture in the I, which means that another always thinks in me, another who must also be thought. The good throw of the dice affirms all of chance in one throw, and it is here that we find the essence of what is called a question. There are nevertheless several throws of the dice. The throw of the dice is repeated, each, however, takes the chance all at once, instead of having the different combinations result from the same, as the same or the repetition result from the difference. In this sense, the repetition, which is consubstantial with the question, is at the source of the perplication of ideas. The differential of the idea is itself inseparable from the process of repetition which defined the throw of the dice. What defines the extraordinary power of that clothed repetition more profound than bare repetition is the reprise of singularities by one another, the condensation of singularities one into another, as much in the same problem or idea as between one problem and another, or from one idea to another. Repetition is this emission of singularities, always with an echo or resonance, which makes each the double of the other, or each constellation the redistribution of another. If being is above all difference and commencement, capital B being is itself repetition, the recommencement of being. Repetition is the provided of the condition which authenticates the imperatives of being. Capital B. This is the constant ambiguity of the notion of origin and the reason for our earlier deception. Origins are assigned only in a world which challenges the original as much as the copy, and an origin assigns a ground only in a world already precipitated into universal ungrounding. There is no idea of the negative any more than there are hypotheses in nature, even though nature does proceed by means of problems. Ideas contain all the varieties of differential relations, and all the distributions of singular points coexisting in diverse orders perplicated in one another. When the virtual content of an idea is actualized, the varieties of relation are incarnated in distinct species, while the singular points, which correspond to the values of one variety, are incarnated in the distinct parts characteristic of this or that species. We call the determination of the virtual content of an idea differentiation with a T. We call the actualization of that virtuality into species and distinguished parts differentiation with a C. Revolution is the social power of difference, the paradox of society, the particular wrath of the social idea. Revolution never proceeds by way of the negative. The virtual is opposed not to the real, but to the actual. The virtual is fully real insofar as it is virtual. Exactly what Proust said of states of resonance must be said of the virtual. Real without being actual, ideal without being abstract. For a potential or virtual object to be actualized is to create divergent lines which correspond to, without resembling, a virtual multiplicity. The nature of the idea is to be distinct and obscure. In other words, the idea is precisely real without being actual, differentiated with a T without being differentiated with a C, and complete without being entire. Distinctness-obscurity is intoxication. Philosophy is revealed not by good sense, but by paradox. Paradox is the pathos or the passion of philosophy. Difference becomes qualitative only in the process by which it is cancelled in extension. In its own nature, difference is no more qualitative than extensive. The eternal return is neither qualitative nor extensive, but intensive, purely intensive. In other words, it is said of difference. This is the fundamental connection between the eternal return and the will to power. The one does not hold without the other. The will to power is the flashing world of metamorphoses, of communicating intensities, differences, of breaths, insinuations, and exhalations, a world of intensive intentionalities, a world of simulacra, or mysteries. If the eternal return reduces qualities to the status of pure science, and retains of extensities only what combines with the original depth, even at the cost of our coherence and in favor of a superior coherence, then the most beautiful qualities will appear, the most brilliant colors, the most precious stones, and the most vibrant extensions. For once reduced to their seminal reasons, and having broken all relation with the negative, these will remain forever affixed in the intensive space of positive differences. Then in turn the final prediction of the Phaedo will be realized in which Plato promised, to the sensibility disconnected from its empirical exercise temples, stars, and gods, such as had never been before seen, unheard of affirmations. The prediction is realized. It is true only by the very overturning of Platonism. Let us reconsider the movement of ideas which is inseparable from a process of actualization. For example, an idea or multiplicity such as that of color is constituted by the virtual coexistence of relations between genetic or differential elements of a particular order. These relations are actualized in qualitatively distinct colors, while their distinctive points are incarnated in distinct extensities, which correspond to these qualities. The qualities are therefore differentiated with a C, along with the extensities, insofar as these represent divergent lines along which the differential relations, which coexist only in the idea, are actualized. We have seen that every process of actualization was in this sense a double differentiation with a C, qualitative and extensive. The categories of differentiation with a C no doubt change according to the order of the differentials constitutive of the idea. Qualification and partition are the two aspects of physical actualization, just as organization and the determination of species are of biological actualization. However, the qualities differentiated with a C by virtue of the relations they actualize impose their own requirements, as do the extensities differentiated with a C by virtue of the distinctive points they incarnate. That is why we propose the concept of differentiation with both a T and C to indicate at once both the state of differential relations in the idea or virtual multiplicity and the state of the qualitative and extensive series in which these are actualized by being differentiated with a C. Thereby, however, the condition of such actualization remains completely indeterminate. How is the idea determined to incarnate itself and differentiate with the C qualities and differentiate with the C extensities? What determines the relations coexisting within the idea to differentiate with the C themselves in qualities and extensities? The answer lies precisely in the intensive quantities. Intensity is the determinant in the process of actualization. It is intensity which dramatizes. It is intensity which is immediately expressed in the basic spatio-temporal dynamisms and determines an indistinct differential relation in the idea to incarnate itself in a distinct quality and a distinguished extensity. The act of individuation consists not in suppressing the problem, but in integrating the elements of the disparateness into a state of coupling which ensures its internal resonance. We believe that individuation is essentially intensive, and that the pre-individual field is a virtual ideal field made up of differential relations. Individuation is the act by which intensity determines differential relations to become actualized along the lines of differentiation with a C, and within the qualities and extensities it creates. The nucleus and the genes designate only the differentiated with a T, matter, in other words, the differential relations which constitute the pre-individual field to be actualized. But their actualization is determined only by the cytoplasm, with its gradients and its field of individuation. Creation is always the production of lines and figures of differentiation with the C.